My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the CEO of After the Fire. We have a very special guest on this week's episode. Mr. Tennis Wick is the Director of PRMD for the County of Sonoma. We're bringing Tennis on the show because he has a lot of experience navigating disasters while they're happening, and also navigating, how do you rebuild? What from the public side, what is it that you need to know about? And how do you even navigate that as a public sector official, as well as the person on the other side of the rebuilding? I wanted Tennis to come on today because I saw his work during the 2017 wildfire disaster that struck the North Bay of San Francisco. It was an incredibly hard thing to navigate, and I feel like he really showed up for people, and it was not without a great personal sacrifice in many ways. We often look towards the public sector in times of great disaster for all of the answers. We also often place all of the blame at their feet. And it's not that that isn't always warranted, but one thing we forget is that there's a human being at the center of that too. And they've often undergone the disaster themselves. One of the things that we do at After the Fire is we help public officials actually navigate this time. And we also help the public navigate public officials. This is really important work because there is no way to actually get through a disaster without collaboration from all sectors, public, private, and nonprofit. That requires a measure of grace at the time when it's most difficult sometimes to offer it. So I wanted Tennis to come on to talk about his experience navigating 4 mega fires and 1 flood in the past 4 years alone. So once again, welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster, and welcome to the show, Tennis Wick. Once again, welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. Today's guest is Tennis Wick, and what I'd like to start off is having Tennis tell you about himself, his position, and what exactly do you do for the county?
Well, good morning, Jennifer. Thanks for having me on. Tennis Wick, Director of Permit Sonoma. We're the land use regulation agency for the county. We balance environmental protection with sustainable development. And we also staff the planning and intelligence section and emergency operations for the county.
So I've had the pleasure of working with you for about 4.5 years at the county. And during that time in 2017, we underwent a mega fire disaster covering 4 counties, heavily impacting Sonoma County. We lost about 6,000 units of housing, and it really was a sort of a sign of things to come for the rest of the American West. I'm hoping that you can talk to people today about your experience just as a human being in a lead position for the County of Sonoma and how you experienced that event.
Sure. So about 10 days before the 2017 complex fire, we actually had done a tabletop exercise with our team in emergency operations, gaming a fire that happened above Oakmont. So we had the strategy in place about how to respond to a fire. What we weren't prepared for is what happened that night. And for me, I live in Petaluma, and my phone started ringing around midnight to get up to the emergency operations center in Santa Rosa right away. So flipped into my clothes, got into my truck, started driving out of town, and I didn't get as far as Bodega Avenue, just on the edge of downtown. Before
but for people in another area, can you give them like the measurements of that? Because they may not know what Bodega is. So like Bodega is actually in Petaluma.
Yes, and sorry, Bodega is, as the name would imply, is the market road. that leads from the coast and the agricultural part of the West County into Petaluma and connecting us with the Bay Area. So major arterial, and at midnight, there's usually very few people on it. And when I got out there, there were thousands of cars streaming from the West County through town. Of course, we could smell smoke. And as I passed the gas station on the edge of town, there were people already fighting over gasoline. And I thought, okay, this is way bigger than anything we've dealt with. And then, of course, going up the highway with almost nobody going northbound and all the southbound lanes full, all the roads leading out of the county jammed. We were already in chaos. Really, that's what it was. And when I got into the emergency operations bunker, the setting was pretty similar. I think this was the biggest disaster that the county had ever faced at that time. And I've come to learn, since going through many disasters since then, here in Sonoma County and in other jurisdictions where we provided support, that that's the nature of it. There's a lot of disinformation flying back and forth. And our job is to sort that out, figure out what's really happening, where it's happening, and how we get resources there.
So this was the first time that we had experienced, anybody had experienced a mega fire of this magnitude and had taken out not just homes in the wildland urban interface, but had actually taken the freeway overpass around and took out another 1,500 homes. So you walk into the emergency operations center, and there is, one of the things, I talk to a lot of leaders on this podcast, and one of the things that I always like to bring in is there is the call to duty and the call to action and to help, and at the same time managing your own trauma, because it was an incredibly traumatic thing to witness. So can you talk about what mode you went into? What were the next 10 to 14 days like for you?
Nonstop. So we typically are told that we're going to operate on 12-hour shifts. And it ended up being pretty much around the clock the first 3 days. And as you said, with parts of the fire attacking parts of Santa Rosa, like Coffee Park, that no one would ever think of as the wildland urban interface. And also Oakmont, and then coming down Fountain Grove towards downtown Santa Rosa. And that threat remained for over a week. So we were even looking at where to set up a local assistance center in Santa Rosa. And at the same time, we were also realizing the struggle that if we put it in certain locations, we'd still have the risk of the fire taking out the assistance center. So we were still fighting the fire and trying to help fire survivors simultaneously. Yeah, it was extraordinary.
And you had the extra added bonus that we had many fires at once. So the Tubbs fire was the major fire, but Napa was also on fire, which borders Sonoma County. And where I live in Sonoma Valley, we were surrounded by a ring of fire. And so we were surrounded by a ring of fire, which really hampered the county's ability to actually serve a valley of 40,000 people. And that was an extraordinary thing to witness both our strengths and our vulnerabilities. You also had 400 people from patients from a very, very medically fragile community at Sonoma Developmental Center. So can you address, how the Emergency Operations Center had to be creative at times to make sure that the needs were met?
Yeah, that was, and I'm glad you brought up the Nuns fire and the Etna fire in relation to Sonoma Valley, because that was an extraordinary time. My family, like your family, has been in Sonoma Valley for generations, very close to heart for me. And the incident commander, who's the CAL FIRE chief, who's in charge of the whole thing, called at one point and said his team, which is an extraordinary group of people, were tapped out. And he wasn't sure how long he could hold the fire off from the town of Sonoma. And he needed us to come up with an evacuation plan for Sonoma Valley. And that we had 4 hours to do it before he would have to execute. So I've told this to numerous groups since then, that it really showed the power of a liberal arts education, because the people on our team are from all sorts of backgrounds, technical and liberal arts. And that emphasis on public service, critical thinking, and clear communication, the pillars that we use for hiring in our civilian life here in Permit Sonoma, served us really well that night. Because you can go through all the training in the world you want. But when you receive a task like that, you need creative thought and people that can work well and communicate and operate quickly. So we had to do what people might see more typically for hurricanes in Florida, and figure out contraflow on state highways to get tens of thousands of people onto public transit and out of harm's way. So part of it was identifying the most vulnerable populations, as you mentioned, those at Sonoma Developmental Center, those at senior homes, figure out how we are going to wrangle every single bus in the region to come in. How do we get them in as cars are going out? And then where we take them. So all of the sensitive populations had to go to places outside of harm's way in the East Bay and the Inner Delta. That was an incredible logistics exercise. And then for fire survivors who needed another place to go, we at first were relocating them to the Civic Center in Marin County, and then found out 2 hours into the 4 we wouldn't be able to. So I called my old friend Steve Page, and it's an example of the extraordinary nature of Sonoma County. So here's someone I've known for decades. Called him and said, Steve, I need your help. And he said, what can we do? I said, I need a place to put 20,000 people. And he said, okay, we'll be ready. What else do you need? It was a 90-second conversation. There was no histrionics. It was just about, what do we do to help the community? And that just galvanized things for our team. And up until 10 minutes of the execution point, we had a plan in place. It was being implemented. Transportation was coming in. Logistics were already setting up at the raceway. And that's when the incident commander called and said, we think we can hold the fire.
Wow. That's interesting, because you and I have had a lot of conversations about this fire and a lot of experience together. And I knew that you had called Steve Page. And for our listeners who don't know who Steve Page is, he just retired as the longtime manager of Sonoma Raceway, which is a very large, prominent raceway in town. He's one of the most steady, competent, kind, and admirable leaders that I've ever worked with. And I know that I benefited from your phone call, because I was evacuated, my sister, my entire family, my mother, my niece, my husband, and that we went to go to the Sonoma Raceway, and that's where we evacuated to. I slept in my car with my dogs because I still had to work. And and immediately when we pulled up, I remember finally rounding that corner, and it was at night because it took a long time, and all the lights were blaring, and there were people waiting for us with whatever we needed, and then coming around and checking on us. So it really was one of the most moving experiences, especially as somebody who's a helper, and I don't accept a lot of help, which is something we will talk about in this podcast. To feel safe and to feel sort of rescued in that moment. So I applaud that decision. And it's also the value of relationships. Like you knew exactly who you were dealing with ahead of time. And there's just so much to be said about leaning on those relationships in a time of great crisis.
That we fortunately haven't let go of to this day. Aside from my office phone annoyingly going off with a spam call just now, almost all and I know this among all my peers in professional life, that people I deal with, we're on cell phones now. We don't use our office phones anymore. So it has quickened the relationships and deepened the relationships that we have with people after the disaster. So it's a good thing.
It's very important, because then at some point you realize, especially working 20 hours a day, I would feel guilty for the 4 hours I was sleeping, but you do get sort of to the other side, and then and the fire becomes contained, and it actually burned in our area for 24 days.
Yeah.
But it was contained pretty well after about 10 to 12 days. The danger was lessened. And then for you, in addition to doing that, you then had to make decisions with the county leadership about how do we even begin to approach rebuilding 6,000 units of housing. And we're going to do this with people who are traumatized and have had a lot of things done to them that were not their choice. And all of a sudden you have at least 5,000 people who have never wanted to build a house ever have to become independent contractors. So let's talk about what that was like.
Yeah, it was an adrenaline drop where you're just constantly going. I think I lost, thankfully, lost 10 pounds over the course of about 2 weeks, just being on adrenaline the entire time. So we had to transition out of disaster response and into recovery. So what it meant for our organization is inspectors moved out into the field with CAL FIRE peers, started doing the important code determinations on each of the properties. So red tag, yellow tag, green tag, along with a damage assessment that's done for emergency management purposes on thousands of properties. So that was going on in one arm of our organization. The other arm of our organization was working with some colleagues in the county on a joint local assistance center with the city. So taking over the old newspaper building in the downtown of Santa Rosa while the fire's still going, and setting up a system where people could come in and start rebuilding their lives. And that wasn't just the bureaucracy of getting your house re-permitted. It was really helping people recreate their identities. And what I mean by that is most people in these fires, they lost all their credentials. So they lost birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, all the things that those of us who haven't been through disaster just take for granted, and all of the benefits that accrue from those documents. They lost all that. So we had people in the local assistance center from the Department of Motor Vehicles, from Social Security Administration, from the State Department, for both the United States and Mexico, so that people could get that part done. They could then move into working with insurance advocates, with people from the construction industry, from the licensing contractors board, things they could learn about what to look for when they're hiring and not hiring a builder. So in addition to getting records on their property. So it took sometimes 3 hours to work through all that, but they came out the door really thankful, because they walked out with a provisional driver's license, passport, some way of figuring out how to get their birth certificates, which of course come from many states or different countries, and starting to get their life back together. And then we had to reopen our doors here at Permit Sonoma, where we normally serve about 150 people a day in our permit center. That first day we opened, it was, I believe, 425. So an extraordinary number of people coming through who were with raw nerves, some with anger, some in tears, some both. But the moment I will always remember was this couple who would be about my parents' age. So they were in their approaching 90s. They'd lost their house. And here was this very proud man who was just exhausted. His wife was asking the right questions and getting records for their property, and you could just see he was about to break down and lose it. And our very wonderfully crusty surveyor, county surveyor, Gabe Gabrielson, saw this and just quietly went out, kind of took him to the back of the office where he could have his cry, compose himself, and come back and join his spouse. And I thought that that's the moment things started building back for us.
It's amazing. And I think Gabe is a great surveyor, by the way. It's amazing though, how being human to each other, like in our best, like that's the thing I actually love about disaster is, while it is a terrible thing that happened, and I don't love that it happened at all, but I do appreciate the opportunities for the very best of humankind to show up. And
Oh my
we're
God,
all,
yes.
you know, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to sometimes, you know, grouch even at each other or make decisions, or, you know, from a place of trauma. Oh yeah. Yeah. You know me. Yeah. Yeah. Kenneth and I are friends. So he knows. It's fine. I am exactly.
I still fear you to this day, even when we're on camera.
Oh, you don't fear me at all. I tried to work. So funny. Here's my interjection. As I'm driving back to the county after 2 weeks of serving in the Valley, I am driving back to my cubicle with the window view, smallest cubicle in the county. And I look up in the hills of Glen Ellen and I say, you know, what I want is to dedicate my life to rebuilding this place, to helping these people. Like, I want to put all my, whatever I can do. And I don't know what I can do really. So the first person I tried to go work for was you. I wanted to be your ombudsman because I really respect you and I like working with you. And so that is a compliment, except you didn't hire me. So, but I'm okay with that because I think I've landed on my feet. It's all good.
You're not a code nerd and you never will be. And thank you for that. This is much better for you.
Well, it is. It's actually a great fit for me, but it also still allows me to work with people like you and you specifically. And so, you know, I do choose the people I admire to be on this podcast, and this is why we're here. But it was such an extraordinary thing to work for the public sector because so much anger, trauma, and grief it was in the community. It really, for someone who's never experienced a wildfire disaster, it is very much a run for your life situation that gets progressively often way worse than you think it could possibly be. Just as like it's really bad and somehow it's worse because the fire monster is still coming for you and people lose. And as you said, unlike wind and rain, like sometimes they lose everything, but often they don't, or they can find their identity. And so it was like the clothes, like people do evacuate in their skivvies, you know, or naked. Like this is, it's for their lives. They run for their lives. And so you are now having to serve a population who need to rebuild their lives and to do it in a way that reduces the trauma. And one of the things that I really like about how we approach this in Sonoma County has to do with the block captain system.
Oh, good. I'm glad you brought it up.
I'd love it if you could talk about how that actually served both the public and the public sector servants, because we try to talk communities into, we highly recommend it, put it that way. And it's often met from the public sector side with a lot of concern that now it's going to organize and weaponize against them. And I always try to help them understand that it's actually, it's all of us doing our part. So can you talk about the impact?
Sure. I think the block captain's idea, at least in my experience, really emanated with Supervisor Gore. And it was really great because he made sure that the bureaucracy didn't do its control psychology thing, which it typically does. It says, we're going to have a meeting in this location at this time. We're going to give you this information. You're going to assimilate it and leave. That's the convention of how government works. And he turned it on its head and said, look, fire survivors look at Santa Rosa as a community or Sonoma as a community, not whether they're in the incorporated or unincorporated area. So we're going to let these communities who already who already know who they are, and they're going to come to us with their leaders, and we're going to go out into their community, which obviously had been decimated in the case of Larkfield Wiki up in and Coffee Park. So we're gonna let them tell us where it's convenient for them to meet, at what time, and in what place. And we're going to be there, whether we're in the water utility, the county government, or the city government. And we're going to be there with people from the trades and nonprofits, whoever these people need. And your job is to just be available. That was great. It set a tone that said, from the leadership down, that these people are our first priority. Listen to them. And from that, you'll figure out what you need to do. That was fabulous.
And not to be afraid. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah. So then it got, and fortunately, people like David Guin, who was my counterpart at the city at the time, were already friends outside work. And it really helped reinforce with us what we were already informally talking about and that was taking a common approach to the rebuilding portion of it, in that we, both organizations were already looking at record business before the disaster, and having fire survivors have to wait in the same line with other people was just not realistic. We realized we had that the local assistance center was a common success. We needed to build on that, maybe in a little bit different way, so we could provide the oversight we needed to. But we brought in consultant teams at each city, at each government center, and committed to 5-day turnaround on permits. And maybe that would have happened without the block captain process, but it certainly, after going to the first couple of meetings with block captains, there was no way we could do things the way we used to. We had to come up with something that was different. And yeah, it's worked. In fact, the trailers in which the rebuilding happened here at the Resiliency Permit Center, we still have it in the old Planning Commission chambers, but it used to be in trailers out here for years. Those trailers are finally leaving today.
There's also, I think really what you're touching upon is the dedication to that sort of creative problem solving that you mentioned at the very beginning though too. And also a commitment to meet people where they're at. Like that's critical in disaster. You know, our first question we always ask, and it sits at the center of our organization, is we say, what do you need and how can we help? Which is very different from, we know you have needs, here's what we're willing to do. Just a different.
Absolutely.
It's a different
approach. And it started to impact our practice after disaster in our regular work.
And accidentally, I know you didn't mean it this way, but it ended up being great. And it's very much part of our work anyway, is that, you know, the consultant team that you brought in, and we don't need to name them necessarily because we can't endorse, but they have since been in so many other areas. Like we work in Santa Cruz and now they're there, and we work in Jackson County, Southern Oregon, and they are, I believe they're coming on there as well.
Yep,
and so
they're also in the city of Paradise.
Yep, they sure are. They've done a great job with Paradise. And it's been, you know, you accidentally sort of gave them this specialty, and it reduces the trauma significantly for the people who are having to undergo. It's not just the trauma of running for your life, and then it's the trauma of losing your house, and then it's the trauma of, or the process and the journey of actually rebuilding your house. And for some people, despite best efforts, they were still the victims of contractor fraud. Can you address that?
The contractor fraud part, or the whole?
Either or all of the above, but contractor fraud is just always a major concern. And no, I don't think any disaster community ever escapes it, you know?
No, I don't think so either. I mean, you can read books by Carl Hyacin that actually find a way of making it humorous. But it is something that unfortunately happens in every disaster, you know, looting and fraud. It's just part of human nature, unfortunately. In fact, we were just talking about the stress that the entire state is under with multiple disasters, not having enough professionally licensed contractors to do the work that needs to be done, the strain on labor and materials, So what our contractors, both in Permit Sonoma and in the rebuild division, are facing in the Resiliency Permit Center is that they inspect homes for code compliance, but not all quality assurance that the homeowner is contracted for. So if your building is stout and meets code requirements, it passes inspection. But there might be really horrible installation of cabinets and countertops. And if you're the homeowner, all that's important to you because you're pulling every financial string possible to make it all work. And people are under constant strain if they don't have a good, reputable contractor. That stress probably starts way back in insurance. If you're underinsured, you're already coming in with less money than you need to build back what you had. So unless you're going to build a smaller place, you're constantly going to be under pressure. So that's one of the things we really guard against. And fortunately, we have a district attorney that has people in her office assigned to work with us on at a local level on contractor fraud, and also with local investigators from the licensing board that are based here in Santa Rosa.
And I think, I think that for some people who have never experienced a disaster, one of the common things that happens is everyone wants to get back to normal right away. And even though that day is gone, like that, you can't get October 7th back. It's not happening, which is very, also deserves its own level of grief. But part of that means that people who are in this survivor position, they make a lot of decisions trying to get everything right back to where it needed to be. It's a trauma response. And we do a lot of work with Fannie Mae, and if they or Freddie Mac underwrite your mortgage, you can actually push your, if you have a 30-year fix, you're in year 7, you can actually push year 7 to year 31 and take a minute. And I think that the more people understand that there are mechanisms to help you, you need a minute. A lot has changed since 2017, though, in the world of rebuilding. Rebuilding takes many, many years, and Sonoma County is really far, far ahead of the curve for, ahead of predictions by far. And there's many reasons for this. And the first reason is our land values are very high. Yeah. And we are incentivized. Go ahead.
And because of that, people are usually indebted, and that debt came along with an insurance requirement. That valuation and insurance didn't necessarily carry through to our more rural counties where it's really been hard to rebuild.
Rural counties, actually, as we transition into our evolution and our rebranding, which is after the fire, our major concern is rural counties, and they're it's very, very difficult to recover or rebuild if you're not a well-resourced county. You can be rural. We are rural and well-resourced, but most rural counties are not well-resourced. And so we can talk about that a lot. But I would like you to talk about in the last 4 years, you've navigated 4 mega fires and 1 flood. So right. Talk to us, like between 2017 and today, what have you learned, or what has surprised you the most? You've learned a lot. So, but what would you want somebody who's listening to this podcast to know, who is a public sector leader? And then what would you want a fire survivor to know on how to navigate this?
Ooh, well, that's quite a question.
I know.
I'll tell you, well, maybe I could relate it to something that's happened most recently, because you're right. I feel like we have been on average in emergency operations 60% of the year since 2017, either responding to flood, fire, power shutdown, pandemic. We've been involved in all of them. It has created a level of readiness that makes me incredibly proud of being part of the county family. It's exhausting to especially do that, and then fall back into your regular civilian life, and then at a moment's notice back into disaster. But what that constant back and forth has taught me is we can't live this way anymore, and that we have to stop responding to disaster and get in front of it once and for all. So yesterday there's a press release informing the public that we've released our draft hazard mitigation plan. This is a plan that people used to take as an obligation, not the first priority. And this is basically how we respond to different types of hazards. And it's necessary to have in place and have it certified in order to get federal funding. Well, now we understand existentially why it's important, and that disaster doesn't care about bureaucratic borders. So we did it in concert with a number of other local governments, cities, fire districts, all together. So I think it prepares us better as an overall community for disaster, and will have us ready for the kind of funding we need to respond. But it's still a response document. However, it will help us as we overhaul the general plan to start addressing some of the climate action needs that are obviously here, because sea level rise is accelerated, fires have accelerated, flooding has accelerated, drought has accelerated, and you can either be overwhelmed by it, or you can start planning for it and being smart about it. So one of the things that happened in this last fire, it was, as I have related to people, we have a really great relationship with Ben Nichols, who's the CAL FIRE chief. Born and raised here, the man knows every contour in this county. And he came in for a midnight burrito dinner in the bunker. And it was a rare moment because many of the staff from our natural resource and fire and planning staff are also in emergency operations. So we took an opportunity to talk to our fire specialist about how we get in front of this. How do we stop responding to fire and learn to manage it and live with it? And you start by interviewing your fire specialist, your fire expert. And he said, fire is always looking for its next meal. And with the war map that we have up, with the whole county shown, he took us through. So what are the 3 areas we need to be focusing on? And he pointed to the lower Russian River, because the time the Walbridge fire was just coming through there, we're trying to Mark West, which is just topographically, meteorologically ideal for fire over and over again, as we've learned. And then, as you mentioned, fire has tried but failed so far to get, thankfully, to get through Glen Ellen and Kenwood and over Sonoma Mountain to Petaluma Valley. So with that charge, we started applying for the BRIC grant, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities application. We, especially our fire and natural resource people, took all of their experience from all these disasters and their storied professions and put that energy into this proposal. And what we told the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Governor's Office for Emergency Services is, look, Sonoma County is a different kind of place. It's a very representative county in some ways, but also has this unique experience to constant response to disasters in a relatively short period of time. And what we think, with a population of 500,000 and 1 million acres, with so much of this wildland that's at risk of fire in private hands, we can create a management with all different tools that starts with the building and works out, and from the wildland and works in, to focus on structural hardening, defensive space, and vegetation management. And vegetation management with all measure of tribal partners and learning how to do prescribed burns, fire experts in prescribed burns, taking care of fire breaks that we've already built with all these fires, agricultural partners who can show us how to use livestock and crop planting as fire breaks, mechanical fuels management, hand fuels management, all of these measures in these 3 geographic areas, and then we can scale it up for a whole county, and then we can become an example for how that can apply in the state and the federal government. So it was with great pleasure and surprise during a fire division staff meeting when this little email came up on the right-hand corner of my computer screen during the Zoom that said, White House press conference, please click here. And at first I thought it was spam and thought, what the heck? So I clicked on it and it was the White House, and there was the president along with Governor Newsom, Vice President Harris, and Governor Brown from Oregon, announcing that Sonoma County would be the first recipient of a BRIC grant application in the country. So out of a $400 million program, 37 million of that is dedicated to us. So we've found the money to match the grant. Thank you, Board of Supervisors, for giving us the opportunity to innovate and spend the time on this application that we need. And now now's the fun part. Mark Ghilarducci from who heads OES wanted a Scout's Honor promise that we would live up to our end of the bargain, and here we go.
And I think, it was a moment of pride for every person in Sonoma County to see, all of the hard work that has been put into actually applying for that grant and the work, sort of everything we've been through for the past almost nearly 4 years, yep. And that we collectively lean into learning and how to do better, and then also how to pay it forward. So whatever I love that he peaked that, I call him the Dooch secretly. Don't tell him that. He'll never listen to this podcast probably, so it's fine. He's the head of Cal OES, that he, basically said, do this right and do this well. And what we know is that you're going to do this right. You're going to do this well. You're going to make mistakes, but also you're going to pay it forward to other communities so that they too so they can sort of start a little bit ahead of, where I feel like in Sonoma County, we are innovating our way through this, which is great, but I'm always shocked by the lack of systems that were created. I feel like they should have been created like 40 years ago, but we didn't know. And now our big job is to mitigate the risk. And I am a ardent supporter of vegetation management and an aggressive investment there, because we have historically mismanaged our wildlands or neglected them. We've made it political as opposed to, it is a public health issue. It's an infrastructure issue. So can you talk about like the sort of shift in the paradigm that is in the process of happening and is imperfect for sure? I personally would like to see about 100 million in the hopper for vegetation management on private lands. I recently got a question from a reporter though, who said, why should our federal dollars go to help people on private land mitigate their risk? So I know how I answered, but I want to hear how you're going to answer.
Well, so that's, it is, and it's a fair question to ask, because one, as a community, we've allowed people to move into the wildland urban interface. So collectively, we all own that, whether we think it was the right thing to do or not. That's the environmental setting we have. We're all at risk. Tell people and ask people in Coffee Park where the wildland urban interface is. We're all in it now. I think with climate change coming at us in multiple ways, folks, we're all at risk. So unless we want to suffer the tragedy of the commons that most of us suffer because one person doesn't act, we've got to respond collectively to this. If there are political and social equities and economic equities that have to be worked out in the meantime, so be it. But now we're spending billions of dollars of tax money in disaster response. That's certainly not the best way to be using our funding. I think we're going to end up spending less money working on smart disaster intelligence and the proper management of natural resources.
I'm so glad. Yeah. And it costs about 6 times the amount to actually respond to a disaster than it does to actually mitigate the risk of the disaster. So
Yeah.
the public pays for it regardless. And I'm hoping too that we can integrate the question and the very important mission of equity into wildland fuel, mitigation, because every time we have one of these mega fires, it exacerbates, health, for their health being affected by the smoke alone is
Sure.
definitely a question of equity. And so they don't, if you are a marginalized community, your ability to recover at the same rate is just not, it's completely unequal. So we have
And
to
there's an
stop
element of the BRIC grant that will focus on that, because it's something we didn't do our best of in 2017. And I think we all have had to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And things have improved. Are they optimal? Nope. We've got to do a lot better.
We do, but I have, I have confidence, and I think that one of the main things is we have to continue to call each other in, and really resist the opportunity to call each other out so often. There's a lot of anxiety that's played out on social media about, and a lot of armchair experts on wind and rain, and fire and energy and COVID and health. And I think there's a lot to be said for, having a pushback to the return of some respect for expertise. And, I don't tell you how to build a building. I just, I don't, because you went to school for that. You know things. I can say, I would like more, during a disaster, I would like us to invest in Alicia Sanchez at KBBF, and to make sure that all these PSAs go out verbally on the radio in Spanish and indigenous languages. That ICE, for example, will not be at our emergency shelters, because those sorts of things. But I think that we are definitely getting there. So
yes, we are.
What's your advice? So say that this is a person who's in Montana, and for some reason they've picked up this podcast, and all they want to know is, how do I navigate this? How do I navigate the trauma in my community? And at the same time, as a helper, how do I take care of myself?
Well, I could say, as a local government official, if you're in that place where disaster hasn't hit you, but you kind of know it's coming, start training now. It was, and this from your time in county service, it was treated in Sonoma County as an afterthought. It was this grudging obligation we had to fulfill. And that culture has completely changed. We now use it as a placement on a team, and we're about 40 out of 150 people, 40 who are active in emergency operations, and frankly, probably another 50 who are in field response. You have to perform well in your civilian role in order to be considered. So it is almost, in some ways, an excellence academy for public service. And fortunately, it also feeds back on itself by creating, I think, a better public servant that comes out of that back into civilian work. But what I would say to with that in mind, to my colleagues who haven't been through this yet, you will. I don't know what form it's going to take, but it's going to happen to you. So start training now. Reach out to your local FEMA reps. Feel free to reach out to me. I talk with people all over North America, in Canada and the United States. I've been up to British Columbia and spoken there, my home province away from California. And it's all of us sharing. I've learned a whole lot in British Columbia, especially from how they work with First Nations people who are way more involved in disaster response and planning. So you also bring back something, and that experience you gain, it comes back to the community manifold, and you can give back yourself through mutual aid. But I would much rather be talking with people in this forum and directly off camera about it before their disaster hits. So yeah, I'd say start preparing now. It's coming your way.
And it's very hard because we're human and we engage in magical thinking that it won't
Right.
happen to us, and we see it on the news. And I think until I saw my hometown on CNN, I had no clue. We'd been through earthquakes, we'd been through other things,
Right.
but there's something about being the object of the story that was made it more heartbreaking. And even though it was, the intentions were fine, but it was a surreal experience in that sense, for sure. Hey, so Tennis, how do you take care of yourself as a public leader, though? Because one of the things that we talk about is how to help the helpers. And so I would love, if you don't mind, being a little bit personal.
So how do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, how do you take care of yourself?
So it came home to me in a number of ways. I was actually up in the state capitol at a conference about 4 years ago. And of all the risks that I've had to say goodbye to my family twice during natural disasters because I wasn't sure if I was going to see them again. So I make it through all of this stuff. I'm in a crosswalk right near then Governor Brown's flat, and I'm run over by a car. And so I had to recover from that during disasters, something I still live with. And so now I just make my own personal health number one priority, physical and mental health. I get lots of sleep. I don't drink anymore. Caffeine's my only sin. And I make sure that I spend a lot more time with my family and really focus on those core parts of my my personal life that are really important to me. So that's my own approach.
Well, and I think there's, I want to make sure that people really, really hear you, that you have to, as a helper, you have to prioritize your own physical and mental well-being. We've seen a lot of people our colleagues and friends who have prioritized the community. So it's good to give a lot, but you're not supposed to give everything. And I think that's really what I'm hoping.
Yeah, got to make time for yourself.
So we're going to close out here. And I guess what I would like to know is, do you have anything to add that I haven't asked, or anything you'd like the public to know? And including, that's very nice of you to say that they can reach out to you directly. And to be clear, it is Permit Sonoma, Tennis Wick. You can find him online, or you can look at the first slide in this podcast, and it will give you contact information. So
please reach out. And I would say to people, what I see happening, and it's not just in the public sector, but I see it throughout the community. Turn off media for a while and just experience what's happening, because I think actually there's a lot more good news out there than bad. That we are finding a way to respond. You turn on 6 o'clock news and you think the entire state is burning and damnation is tomorrow. It's not. We're actually finding ways to get in front of the problem and start solving it. And as long as we all stay focused, it's easy to find in this environment the worst case. I am focusing on people who will work with me to find the best case and make it better. And I see it out there every day, and that's what gives me hope. And I have every expectation that we're going to successfully deal with climate change and disaster.
And I'm positive that the only way we're going to do it is together.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Tennis Wick, Director of Permit Sonoma at the County of Sonoma. I appreciate your time and your friendship and all of your work and service to the community.
Likewise, my friend. I look forward to seeing each other in person.
Yeah, it's good.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Fannie Mae, the largest provider of mortgage finance in the U.S., owns 1 out of every 4 loans in the country. You can find out if Fannie Mae owns your mortgage at knowyouroptions.com by using our loan lookup tool. This last year has been quite difficult, and making your mortgage payments could be too. There are options for those available that may have experienced a natural disaster such as wildfire or the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the options available is a forbearance plan, where homeowners are given a period of reduced or suspended payments to manage a temporary hardship of financial standing. For this caused by natural disaster or COVID-19 pandemic, you could be eligible for a 6-month extension with a possibility of another 6 months after that. During the forbearance plan, the homeowner is not charged late fees. If you received additional living expense assistance after your disaster, and those funds have run out, you still may be eligible to apply for a forbearance plan. When your forbearance plan ends, your lending or servicer will contact you to see if you need assistance or are ready to resume making your normal scheduled mortgage payments. If you don't hear from them, you should proactively reach out. If you are unable to repay the balance in its entirety, you may arrange a repayment plan, or if eligible, qualify for other programs such as a payment deferral or flex modification. A payment deferral allows you to bring your mortgage current. This option keeps your monthly mortgage payment the same as it was before your hardship, and the total deferred amount will be due on the last scheduled payment of the loan. Should you sell or refinance, the deferred balance is included in the remaining amount due. Flex modification is Fannie Mae's standard modification. Provides 20% principal and interest payment reduction on your mortgage. Once the modification is complete, the loan's term is extended to 40 years. Depending on the circumstances, the modification may result in a reduction of interest rate and/or principal forbearance. What is a principal forbearance, by the way? And that's when a portion of the unpaid principal balance, basically the remaining loan amount, is put into an interest-free balance secured by the loan as part of the flex modification. It can be modified by the maturity date or with an early payoff. More information is available at knowyouroptions.com. When ready to request mortgage assistance, reach out to your mortgage company. This is the company you send your payments to each month, and you'll find that phone number on your mortgage statement. Additional relief assistance is available through our Disaster Response Network. Here, impacted homeowners can work with HUD-approved housing counselors to get help requesting financial relief through FEMA, insurance claims, and more. Homeowners can visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information or call 877-833-1746. Once again, 877-833-1746 or knowyouroptions.com.